Steel-cold gaze. June Callahan had sworn she'd never let another man control her, but when her brother's reckless gambling put their ranch in danger, she had no choice but to deal with Beau Hollister, a man known for collecting what he was owed. He smirked, tilting his hat. "I don't want your land, sweetheart," he murmured. "But I sure as hell want you." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Dry Creek. The wind carried more than just dust through Dry Creek that morning. It carried whispers, the kind that prickled the skin and settled heavy in the gut. June Callahan felt it as she stood on the porch of the weathered ranch house, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. The sun, already a brutal force even at this early hour, beat down on the parched land, turning the air thick and hazy. The air smelled of dry earth and the faint, lingering scent of the meager rain that had fallen weeks ago, a cruel tease in this land of endless thirst. June's hands, calloused and strong from years of working the land, tightened on the worn wooden railing. Her brother, Thomas, was late. Again. He'd ridden out before dawn, promising to be back by mid-morning with supplies from town. But mid-morning had come and gone, leaving only the oppressive heat and the growing knot of unease in June's stomach. Thomas had a way of finding trouble, a knack for turning simple errands into complicated messes. And lately, those messes had been growing more frequent, more expensive. She pushed a stray strand of auburn hair, streaked with silver that seemed to multiply with each passing worry, back from her face. At 58, June carried herself with the resilience of a weathered oak, her body lean and strong, her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, still sharp and unwavering. But the lines etched around those eyes and the faint tremor in her hands spoke of battles fought and hardships endured. The death of her husband, Caleb, 10 years prior, had left a hole in her heart, a void that the vast, unforgiving landscape seemed to echo. She'd learned to live with the ache, to channel her grief into the relentless work of keeping the ranch afloat. But Thomas's recent recklessness threatened to unravel everything she'd fought so hard to preserve. A plume of dust in the distance caught her eye. Her heart quickened, a flicker of hope battling with the dread that had become her constant companion. But as the rider drew closer, her hope withered. It wasn't Thomas. The silhouette was too broad, the posture too confident. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with a power and grace that spoke of wealth and danger. June knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was.
Hollister.
The name itself tasted like bitter ashes on her tongue. Hollister owned the largest spread in the county, a sprawling empire built on ruthless ambition and a reputation for collecting what he was owed. He was a man who inspired both fear and grudging respect, a man who seemed to embody the harsh, unforgiving spirit of the frontier. He was also a man June had carefully avoided for years. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, the animal snorting and pawing the ground, its muscles rippling beneath its sleek coat. Hollister dismounted with an effortless grace that belied his age, which June guessed to be somewhere in his late 40s. He was a striking figure, tall and powerfully built, with a face that could have been carved from granite. His eyes, the color of polished obsidian, were framed by thick, dark brows, and a shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. He wore a dark, well-worn duster, a faded blue shirt, and denim trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots. A silver concho belt buckle glinted in the sun, and a Colt peacemaker rested low on his hip, a silent testament to the lawlessness of the land. He removed his hat, revealing a thick mane of dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, and offered June a slow, deliberate smile. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a smile that held a hint of something dangerous, something predatory. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. "A pleasure to see you again." June didn't return the smile. "Hollister," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. "What brings you to my ranch?" He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the modest ranch house, the parched fields, the distant, hazy mountains. "I believe you know why I'm here, Mrs. Callahan." "If it's about Thomas," June said, her voice hardening, "you'll have to wait. He's not here." Hollister's smile widened, a flash of white teeth against his tanned skin. I'm well aware of that, Mrs. Callahan. I saw your brother in town. Or rather, I saw him leave town in a bit of a hurry. June's heart sank. What did he do? Hollister chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Let's just say he made a rather unwise wager. And he lost. Badly. June closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back the wave of despair that threatened to engulf her. She'd known, deep down, that this day would come. Thomas's gambling had been spiraling out of control, a sickness that had taken root in his soul. She'd tried to talk to him, to reason with him, to plead with him, but her words had fallen on deaf ears, lost in the intoxicating allure of the cards, the dice, the fleeting promise of easy riches. How much? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hollister's eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers. Enough to put this ranch in jeopardy, Mrs. Callahan. Enough to make me a very interested party. He took another step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scent of leather and gunpowder, mingled with the faint, musky scent of his skin, filled her senses. It was a scent that spoke of power, of danger, of a life lived on the edge. It was a scent that both repelled and intrigued her. I don't want your land, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, his eyes raking over her face, lingering on her lips. But I sure as hell want you. June's breath caught in her throat. The audacity of his words, the raw hunger in his eyes, sent a jolt of something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of defiance, a flicker of desire. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. You'll get nothing from me, Hollister, she said, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the fear that was clawing at her insides. I'll find a way to pay my brother's debt. I always do. He leaned in closer, his breath warm on her cheek. I admire your spirit, Mrs. Callahan, but I'm afraid you're out of time. And out of options. His hand reached out, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to touch her. But instead, he simply adjusted his hat, the brim casting a shadow over his eyes, making them even more enigmatic, more dangerous. I'll be back, June. And next time, I expect to have a more satisfactory conversation. He turned and mounted his horse, the movement fluid and graceful. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. You have until sundown tomorrow. And with that, he spurred his horse and rode away, leaving June standing alone in the dust, the whispers of Dry Creek swirling around her, carrying the chilling promise of his return. The sun beat down, relentless and unforgiving, a mirror of the desperate situation she found herself in. She felt a tremor, not just in her hands this time, but deep within her soul. What was she going to do? Chapter 2. A Gamble's Shadow. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, a stark contrast to the growing darkness within June's heart. Hollister's words echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat of threat and something else, something she couldn't quite name, something that disturbed her more than the threat itself. She had retreated inside the ranch house, the familiar, worn furniture offering little comfort. The scent of old wood and beeswax, usually a source of solace, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the life that was slipping through her fingers. She sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table, a chipped porcelain cup of cold coffee untouched before her. The silence of the house pressed in on her, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant howl of a coyote. She tried to think, to plan, to find some way out of the impossible situation Thomas had created. But her mind was a tangled mess of fear and resentment, a whirlwind of what-ifs and could-have-beens. She thought of Caleb, her late husband. He would have known what to do. Caleb had been a rock, a steady presence in the storm of her life. He had taught her everything she knew about ranching, about survival, about enduring the hardships of this unforgiving land. He had also taught her about love, about the quiet, enduring kind that warmed you from the inside out, a love that had sustained her through the darkest days. A wave of grief, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. She hadn't allowed herself to truly mourn Caleb in years, burying her sorrow beneath the relentless demands of the ranch. But now, facing the possibility of losing everything, the dam had broken, and the tears flowed freely. She wept for Caleb, for the life they had shared, for the future they had dreamed of, a future that had been stolen from them. A sudden noise startled her. The front door creaked open, and a figure stumbled into the dimly lit hallway. Thomas. He looked a wreck. His clothes were torn and dusty, his face pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. He swayed slightly, as if struggling to stay upright. "June," he mumbled, his voice slurred. I messed up." June rose from the table, her grief replaced by a surge of anger, hot and fierce. "Messed up?" she said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You gambled away our ranch, Thomas. You gambled away everything we've worked for, everything Caleb and I built." He flinched, avoiding her gaze. I thought I could win it back. I had a good hand? June scoffed. "You always think you have a good hand, Thomas. And you always lose." "How much, Thomas? How much did you lose to Hollister?" He shuffled his feet, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It was a lot, June. More than I could cover." "How much?" June demanded, her voice rising. He finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "Everything, June. I lost everything. The ranch, it's his now." June felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She staggered back, clutching the edge of the table for support. The room seemed to spin, the familiar objects blurring into indistinct shapes. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." "You couldn't." "I did," he said, his voice breaking. "I signed a paper, a deed. I don't even remember." June stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of his betrayal. He had not only gambled away their livelihood, but he had also done it with such reckless abandon, such utter disregard for the consequences, that he couldn't even remember the details. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to physically hurt him for what he had done. But she couldn't. He was her brother, her only remaining family. And despite everything, she still loved him. "Hollister was here," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Thomas paled even further. He was? "He gave me until sundown tomorrow," June continued, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the house. He said he wanted me." Thomas stared at her, his mouth agape. "He what?" June finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "He wants me, Thomas. As payment for your debt." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Thomas looked as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. June turned away from him, unable to bear the sight of his shame and guilt. She walked to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. The last rays of the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the parched fields, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and menacing. She felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her, a numbness that shielded her from the overwhelming despair. She had faced hardships before, she had survived loss and grief, and she would survive this too. She had to. But how? She thought of Hollister, of his dark, intense eyes, of the way he had looked at her, of the way he had said those words, "I want you." A shiver ran down her spine, a mixture of fear and something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. A spark of defiance, a flicker of attraction. She pushed the thought away, disgusted with herself. He was a predator, a man who took what he wanted without regard for the consequences. She would never willingly submit to him. But what choice did she have? She could run, but where would she go? She was a woman alone, in a land where survival was a constant struggle. She could fight, but how could she fight a man like Hollister, a man with wealth and power and influence? The answer, she realized, was that she couldn't. Not alone. She needed help. But who could she turn to? The whispers of Dry Creek seemed to offer no answers, only the chilling reminder of the debt she owed, a debt that was measured not in dollars, but in something far more precious, her freedom. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating, like the coming night. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that her life had changed forever. Chapter 3.
Olistérès proposition.
The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gray, a fragile beauty that offered no solace to June. She had barely slept, tossing and turning in her bed, haunted by nightmares of Hollister and the impending loss of her home. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the heavy, guilt-ridden breathing of Thomas, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, still fully clothed. June rose and dressed in her usual attire, a simple, faded cotton dress, worn leather boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the harsh sun. She moved mechanically, her body stiff and aching, her mind numb with exhaustion and dread. She brewed a pot of strong coffee, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen, a faint reminder of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. She poured herself a cup and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the familiar landscape. The ranch, her home, the only place she had ever truly belonged. It was more than just land and buildings, it was a part of her, woven into the fabric of her soul. The thought of losing it was like losing a limb, a vital part of herself. She heard Thomas stir on the sofa. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, his face pale and drawn. He looked at her, his eyes filled with shame and regret. "June," he began, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say," June said, her voice flat and emotionless. "What's done is done." He rose and walked towards her, his movements slow and hesitant.
"I'll go," he said.
"I'll leave Dry Creek. I'll find work somewhere else. Maybe I can send you money." June shook her head.
"It's too late for that, Thomas."
"The debt is too large. And besides," she added, her voice hardening, "Hollister doesn't want money. He wants—" She couldn't bring herself to say the words again. Thomas flinched. "I'm so sorry, June," he whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." June looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and anger. He was her brother, and she loved him, but his weakness, his inability to resist the lure of gambling, had brought them to this ruin. "Just go," she said, her voice weary. "Go before he gets here." Thomas nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. He grabbed his hat and walked towards the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at her. "I'll make it up to you, June," he said. "I swear I will." June didn't answer. She watched him leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat, a broken man walking away from the wreckage he had created. She was alone again. She finished her coffee and went outside, the morning air still cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the oppressive heat that would soon follow. She walked towards the corral, where her horses were grazing peacefully, their coats gleaming in the early morning light. She leaned against the fence, watching them, finding a small measure of comfort in their familiar presence. A cloud of dust in the distance announced Hollister's arrival. June's heart quickened, her hands clenching into fists. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, to prepare herself for the confrontation. He rode up to the porch and dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He wore the same clothes as the day before, the same dark duster, the same faded blue shirt, the same silver concho belt buckle. The only difference was the expression on his face. There was no smile today, no hint of amusement. His eyes were hard and unyielding, his jaw set in a firm line. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, his voice low and even. "I trust you've had time to consider my proposition." June met his gaze, her chin lifting in defiance. "I have," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And my answer is no." His eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. "I was afraid you'd say that," he said.
"A shame."
"You're a stubborn woman, June Callahan. And you're a ruthless man, Hollister," June retorted. "I won't be your whore." The word hung in the air, stark and ugly. Hollister's eyes flickered, a hint of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps even respect. "I never used that word, Mrs. Callahan," he said, his voice still low and even. "I'm not asking you to be my whore. I'm offering you a partnership." June scoffed. "A partnership? What kind of partnership involves me surrendering my body and my freedom to you?" He took a step closer, his presence dominating the space around her. "The kind that saves your ranch," he said. "The kind that keeps a roof over your head. The kind that gives you a chance to rebuild your life." "At what cost?" June asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. She flinched, pulling away from his touch. "The cost of pride, perhaps," he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "The cost of clinging to the past. The cost of refusing to accept the inevitable." His eyes held hers, dark and intense, drawing her in, making it difficult to breathe. She felt a strange pull towards him, a dangerous attraction that both terrified and excited her. "I'm offering you a choice, June," he continued. "Marry me. Become my wife. And the ranch stays yours. Thomas's debt will be forgiven. You'll have security, protection, a life of comfort." June stared at him, speechless. Marriage? He was offering her marriage? It was the last thing she had expected.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you want to marry me?" He smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because you're a strong woman, June Callahan," he said. "A beautiful woman. A woman who challenges me. A woman who interests me." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her face. "And because I always get what I want." The sun was high now, beating down on them, turning the air thick and heavy. June felt trapped, cornered, like a wild animal facing a hunter. She had a choice to make, a choice that would determine the course of her life. She could refuse and lose everything, or she could accept and lose herself. The whispers of Dry Creek offered no guidance, only the stark reality of her predicament. Her gaze locked with Hollister's, and she knew she was standing at a crossroads. The decision rested solely with her. Chapter 4. Under a blazing sky. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the buzzing of insects and the distant caw of a crow. The sun beat down mercilessly, a physical manifestation of the pressure bearing down on June. Marriage. To Beau Hollister. The idea was both preposterous and strangely compelling. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of mockery. But his expression was unreadable, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. He was a hard man, a ruthless man, but there was also a certain honesty in his gaze, a directness that she couldn't ignore. "You expect me to believe," June said, her voice hoarse, "that you want to marry me out of kindness?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Kindness has little to do with it, Mrs. Callahan. I told you I always get what I want. And I want you as my wife. And what if I refuse?" June challenged, her chin lifting in defiance. His smile faded, his eyes hardening. "Then you lose everything. The ranch, your home, your livelihood. Your brother will be hunted down like a dog. And you," he paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on her lips. "You'll be left with nothing." The threat was clear, and June knew he wasn't bluffing. He had the power to make good on his words, to crush her and Thomas, without a second thought. She looked past him, at the ranch house, at the corrals, at the vast, sprawling land that stretched out before her. It was all she had left, the only tangible connection to her past, to Caleb, to the life she had built. Could she really walk away from it all? But the alternative to become Hollister's wife, to submit to his will, to share his bed, the thought sent a shiver of revulsion through her, mixed with a strange, unsettling flicker of anticipation. She hated him. She despised his arrogance, his power, his casual disregard for her feelings. But she also respected him. He was a survivor, a man who had carved out an empire in this unforgiving land. And there was a raw, untamed energy about him that both frightened and fascinated her. "What kind of life would it be?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "As your wife." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scent of leather and gunpowder, mingled with the faint, musky scent of his skin, filled her senses. "A life of comfort," he said, his voice low and persuasive. "A life of security. You'd want for nothing. You'd be the mistress of my home, respected, protected. You'd have everything you could ever desire except my freedom," June interjected, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers calloused but surprisingly gentle. "Freedom is an illusion, June," he said. "We're all bound by something. Duty, loyalty, debt, love." His eyes held hers, dark and intense, drawing her in. She felt a strange pull towards him, a magnetic force that she couldn't resist. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden desire, and it terrified her. I need time to think," she said, her voice shaking. He nodded, his hand dropping from her cheek.
"You have until sundown," he said.
"That's all the time I can give you." He turned and walked towards his horse, his movements fluid and graceful. He mounted and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Don't make me take what's mine, June," he said, his voice a low growl. "It would be much more pleasant for both of us if you came willingly." And with that, he spurred his horse and rode away, leaving June standing alone under the blazing sky, the weight of his words, the weight of her decision, pressing down on her like a physical burden. She watched him go, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, resentment, and something else. Something she couldn't quite name, something that both repelled and attracted her. She walked back to the porch and sat down heavily on the steps, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The sun was a fiery ball in the sky, beating down on her relentlessly. She felt drained, exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She had a choice to make. A choice between two impossible options. A choice between losing everything she had and losing herself. The whispers of Dry Creek offered no guidance, only the harsh reality of her predicament. She was trapped, caught in a web of circumstance, with no easy way out. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sun, trying to block out the fear, trying to find some semblance of peace, some clarity of thought. But all she could see was Hollister's face, his dark, intense eyes, his slow, deliberate smile. All she could feel was the heat of the sun, the weight of her decision, and the terrifying, exhilarating pull of the unknown. The day was slipping away, and with it, her chance to decide. She had until sundown. Chapter 5. The Weight of Spurs. The afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the parched land, mirroring the turmoil within June. She remained on the porch, unmoving, her mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Each passing hour felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. The weight of Hollister's spurs, a symbol of his power and control, seemed to hang heavy in the air. She tried to distract herself, to focus on the mundane tasks of the ranch, but it was useless. Her hands trembled as she tried to mend a broken fence, her mind racing, replaying Hollister's words, his offer, his threat. She wandered aimlessly through the familiar landscape, her feet moving without conscious thought, her eyes seeing but not registering the beauty that surrounded her. She found herself standing by Caleb's grave, a simple wooden cross marking the spot where he lay buried, overlooking the land he had loved. She hadn't visited his grave in months, guilt and grief making it too painful to bear. But now, facing the possibility of losing everything, she felt drawn to him, seeking his guidance, his strength. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "What am I going to do? I don't know how to choose." The wind rustled through the dry grass, a soft whisper that offered no answers, only the cold comfort of the vast, uncaring landscape. She knelt by the grave, her fingers tracing the weathered wood of the cross. She remembered the day they had buried him, the raw, agonizing pain, the feeling that her world had ended. She had survived that. She had endured, but this felt different. This felt like a slow, agonizing death, a surrender of her soul. She thought of Caleb's strength, his resilience, his unwavering commitment to the land, to her. He would have fought Hollister, she knew. He would have found a way, somehow, to protect what was theirs. But Caleb was gone, and she was alone, facing a choice he would never have had to make. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine what Caleb would tell her to do. But all she could hear was the echo of Hollister's words, his promise of security, his threat of ruin. She opened her eyes and looked out at the land, at the rolling hills, the distant mountains, the vast, open sky. It was a beautiful land, a harsh land, a land that demanded strength and resilience. It was a land that had shaped her, molded her, made her who she was. Could she really give it all up? Could she really walk away from everything she had ever known, everything she had ever loved? But the alternative to become Hollister's wife, to submit to his will, to live a life of gilded captivity, the thought sent a wave of nausea through her. She stood up, her legs shaky, her body weary. She walked back towards the house, her mind still racing, her heart still heavy. She entered the house, the familiar scent of old wood and beeswax offering a small measure of comfort. She looked around the room, at the worn furniture, the faded curtains, the photographs on the mantelpiece, each object a tangible reminder of her past, of her life with Caleb. She saw a small, wooden box sitting on the table, a box she hadn't opened in years. It was Caleb's box, filled with his personal belongings, things she had been too heartbroken to look at after his death. She sat down at the table and opened the box, her hands trembling. Inside, she found his old pocket watch, a silver locket containing a faded photograph of the two of them, a worn leather-bound journal, and a small, folded piece of paper. She picked up the paper and unfolded it, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a letter, written in Caleb's familiar handwriting. She began to read, her eyes blurring with tears. The letter was dated a few weeks before his death. He wrote of his love for her, of his pride in her strength, of his faith in her ability to carry on without him. And then he wrote of Hollister. He wrote of a debt, a gambling debt that Thomas had incurred years ago, a debt that Caleb had secretly paid off, believing he had shielded June from the consequences. He wrote of Hollister's ruthlessness, his ambition, his desire for their land. He warned her to be wary of him, to never trust him. June's hands shook as she finished reading the letter. Caleb had known. He had known about Hollister, he had known about the threat, and he had tried to protect her, even from beyond the grave. A surge of anger, hot and fierce, coursed through her. Hollister had lied. He had known about the old debt. He had used it as leverage, as a way to manipulate her, to force her into his arms. The realization gave her a newfound clarity, a renewed sense of purpose. She wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him take what was hers, what was Caleb's. She would fight. But how? She looked at the pocket watch, the locket, the journal, each object a tangible reminder of Caleb's love, of his strength. She felt a surge of determination, a resolve that she hadn't felt in years. She closed the box, her mind made up. She knew what she had to do. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land. The time was drawing near. She had a choice to make, and she had finally made it. The weight of the spurs felt less oppressive, replaced by a new burden, the fight ahead. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Canyon. June stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the stifling heat of the day. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking panorama of fiery orange, deep crimson, and soft violet, a final, defiant burst of beauty before the darkness descended. She watched the sunset, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and determination. She had spent the last hour preparing, gathering what few resources she had, making what little plans she could. She had saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, and packed a small bag with supplies, food, water, a blanket, and Caleb's old rifle, a weapon she hadn't touched in years. She had also changed her clothes, discarding the faded cotton dress for a pair of sturdy denim trousers, a long-sleeved shirt, and a leather vest. She felt a strange sense of empowerment in the masculine attire, a feeling of shedding the vulnerability of a woman and embracing the strength of a survivor. She heard the sound of approaching hooves, the rhythmic beat growing louder as Hollister drew closer. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, to steel herself for the confrontation. He rode up to the porch and dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He was dressed as he had been before, the dark duster, the faded blue shirt, the silver concho belt buckle, all symbols of his power and wealth. He looked at her, his dark eyes assessing, questioning. "June," he said, his voice low and even. "Have you made your decision?" She met his gaze, her chin lifting in defiance. "I have," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And my answer is still no." His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "You're making a mistake, June," he said. "A big mistake." "I don't think so," June retorted. "I know about the old debt, Hollister. The one Caleb paid off years ago. You lied to me." His expression remained unchanged, his eyes revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "A minor detail," he said, his voice dismissive. "The fact remains, your brother owes me. And you're the only way to settle that debt." "I won't be your pawn, Hollister," June said, her voice hardening. "I won't be used to settle Thomas's debts, or yours." He took a step closer, his presence dominating the space around her. "You have no choice, June," he said, his voice a low growl. "You belong to me now." June reached behind her back, her hand closing around the cold, hard steel of Caleb's rifle. She pulled it out, leveling it at Hollister's chest. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her grip on the rifle firm. "And I'm not afraid to use this." Hollister stared at her, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to resist. "You wouldn't shoot me," he said, his voice still calm, but a hint of uncertainty creeping in. "Try me," June challenged, her finger tightening on the trigger. The silence stretched between them, thick and tense, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant howl of a coyote. The echoes of the canyon seemed to amplify the tension, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Hollister studied her face, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of hesitation. But June met his gaze, her eyes unwavering, her determination clear. He slowly raised his hands, a gesture of surrender. "All right, June," he said, his voice calm and even. "You've made your point. I won't force you." June didn't lower the rifle.
"Get off my land, Hollister," she said.
"And don't come back." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on hers. "I'll go," he said. "But this isn't over, June. You can't run from me forever." He turned and mounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You're a fool, June Callahan," he said. "A brave fool, but a fool nonetheless." And with that, he spurred his horse and rode away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. June watched him go, her body trembling with adrenaline, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced him down, she had defied him, but she knew this was only the beginning.
He would be back.
She had no doubt about that. She lowered the rifle, her hands shaking. She felt a strange mixture of relief and fear, of triumph and vulnerability. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. She turned and walked towards Belle, her loyal mare, her only companion in this fight. She mounted and rode away from the ranch, heading towards the distant mountains, towards the unknown. She didn't know where she was going, she didn't know what she would do, but she knew she couldn't stay. She had to escape, to find a way to protect herself, to protect her land. The night was dark and vast, the stars her only guide. The echoes of the canyon followed her, a reminder of Hollister's threat, a reminder of the battle that lay ahead. She rode on, a lone figure against the immense landscape, a woman fighting for her freedom, for her survival, for her future. The decision was made. she would not surrender. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Homestead. The moon, a silver sliver in the inky sky, offered scant illumination as June rode through the rugged terrain. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sage, a familiar fragrance that usually brought her comfort, but tonight, it only heightened her sense of isolation and vulnerability. She had chosen a path leading away from Dry Creek towards the foothills of the distant mountains, a treacherous route known only to a few. Belle, her trusty mare, navigated the uneven ground with sure-footed grace, her hooves striking the rocky path with a rhythmic beat. June clung to the reins, her body aching, her mind racing. She had escaped Hollister for now, but she knew he wouldn't give up easily. He was a persistent man, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. She needed a plan, a strategy, a way to fight back. But she was alone, with limited resources, facing a powerful and ruthless adversary. The odds were stacked against her, and she knew it. As she rode, she thought of Caleb, of his strength, his resilience, his unwavering love for the land. She remembered the stories he had told her of his youth, of the hardships he had endured, the battles he had fought. He had been a man of courage, a man of principle, and she drew strength from his memory. She also thought of Thomas, her brother, the source of her current predicament. She felt a mixture of anger and pity towards him, a deep sense of betrayal and disappointment. He had always been weak, easily swayed, prone to making bad choices. But he was her brother, her only remaining family, and despite everything, she still loved him. She wondered where he was, what he was doing. Had he truly left Dry Creek? Was he safe? Or was he already caught in Hollister's web? The thought sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She had to find him, to warn him, to protect him, if she could. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, June reached a small, secluded homestead nestled in a hidden valley, a place she hadn't visited in years. It was a ramshackle cabin, built of rough-hewn logs and weathered stone, surrounded by a small, overgrown garden and a crumbling corral. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman she had barely known, a woman who had lived a solitary life, a life shrouded in mystery. June had inherited the homestead after her grandmother's death, but she had never had any use for it, preferring the familiarity and comfort of her own ranch. But now, it offered a refuge, a place to hide, a place to think. She dismounted and led Belle to the corral, her movements stiff and weary. She unsaddled the mare and rubbed her down, her hands moving mechanically, her mind preoccupied. She found some stale hay in a crumbling shed and gave it to Belle, grateful for the small mercy. She entered the cabin, the door creaking open on rusty hinges. The interior was dark and dusty, the air thick with a scent of mildew and decay. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and dust motes danced in the faint light that filtered through the single, grimy window. It was a desolate place, a forgotten place, but it was also safe. For now. June lit a small oil lamp, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked around the room, taking in the meager furnishings, rickety table, 2 rough-hewn chairs, a narrow cot covered in a tattered quilt, and a stone fireplace, cold and empty. She found some firewood in a corner and built a small fire, the flames crackling and popping, providing a small measure of warmth and light. She sat by the fire, her body aching, her mind exhausted. She closed her eyes, trying to rest, trying to gather her strength. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too active, too filled with worry and fear. She rose and began to explore the cabin, searching for anything that might be of use. She found a few rusty cooking pots, some chipped plates and cups, a few dusty blankets, and a small, wooden chest tucked away in a corner. She opened the chest, her heart pounding with a strange sense of anticipation. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, yellowed with age and tied together with a faded ribbon. She recognized the handwriting on the top letter. It was her grandmother's. She sat down by the fire and began to read, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The letters were dated many years ago, written to a man whose name June didn't recognize. They were love letters, filled with passion and longing, with secrets and regrets. As she read, June began to piece together a story of a forbidden love, a story of betrayal and heartbreak, a story that resonated with her own current predicament. Her grandmother had loved a man who had promised her the world, but who had ultimately abandoned her, leaving her with a broken heart and a secret shame. The man's name was Hollister. Not Beau, but his father, a man who had been just as ruthless, just as ambitious as his son. June's hands trembled as she read the final letter, a letter filled with despair and resignation, a letter in which her grandmother vowed to never trust a Hollister again. A chill ran down June's spine. The past was repeating itself. History was rhyming, echoing through the generations. She was facing the same enemy, the same threat that her grandmother had faced years ago. Secrets, hidden in the dust of the old homestead, unveiled the deep roots of her current battle. The weight was no longer just about a brother's debt, it was a family legacy. Chapter 8. A Storm Brewing. The revelation of her grandmother's past and the Hollister connection fueled a new fire in June. It was no longer just about saving her ranch, it was about breaking a cycle of betrayal, a legacy of pain that had stretched across generations. She felt a kinship with her grandmother, a woman she had barely known, a woman who had suffered at the hands of a Hollister, just as she was now. She spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin, making it habitable, trying to impose some order on the chaos of her life. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and aired out the musty blankets. She found a small, rusty stove in a corner and managed to get it working, providing a source of heat for cooking and warmth. As she worked, she thought about her grandmother, about her strength, her resilience, her ability to survive in this harsh and unforgiving land. She drew inspiration from her ancestors' story, a story of a woman who had been wronged, but who had refused to be broken. She also thought about Hollister, about his arrogance, his power, his determination to possess her. She realized that he wasn't just after her land, he was after her spirit, after her defiance. He wanted to break her, to tame her, to make her his own. But she wouldn't let him. She would fight him with every ounce of strength she possessed. She would honor her grandmother's memory, and she would protect her own future. As evening approached, the sky began to darken, not with the gentle hues of sunset, but with the ominous gray of approaching storm clouds. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying the scent of rain and electricity. June looked out the window, watching the storm gather, feeling a strange sense of kinship with the turbulent weather. It mirrored her own inner turmoil, her own brewing storm of defiance and determination. She heard the sound of approaching hooves, the rhythmic beat muffled by the rising wind. Her heart quickened, her hand instinctively reaching for Caleb's rifle, which she had cleaned and loaded earlier in the day. She peered through the window, her eyes straining to see through the gathering darkness. It was Hollister. He was riding alone, his figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, to steel herself for the confrontation. She had known he would come, but she hadn't expected him so soon. He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked towards the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He knocked on the door, the sound loud and insistent, echoing through the small cabin. June didn't answer. She stood by the window, her hand gripping the rifle, her eyes fixed on Hollister's shadowy figure. "June," he called out, his voice raised above the wind. "I know you're in there. Open the door." She remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. He knocked again, harder this time. "June, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." She didn't believe him. She knew he was lying, that he was trying to trick her, to lure her into a false sense of security. He tried the door handle, but it was locked. He rattled the door, his patience wearing thin. "June, open this damn door," he shouted, his voice angry and frustrated. She took a step back, her finger tightening on the trigger of the rifle. She was prepared to shoot if necessary, to defend herself, to protect her refuge. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the cabin in a brief, stark white light. Thunder rumbled, loud and deafening, shaking the very foundations of the small structure. Hollister hesitated, startled by the sudden storm. He looked up at the sky, his face momentarily illuminated by another flash of lightning. He seemed to realize the futility of his efforts, the danger of being caught out in the open during a violent storm. He turned and walked back towards his horse, his shoulders slumped in defeat. June watched him go, her body trembling with adrenaline, her heart still pounding. She had faced him down again, but she knew this was only a temporary reprieve. He would be back. The storm raged throughout the night, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the cabin walls, the thunder echoing through the valley. June sat by the fire, her rifle close at hand, her mind racing. She had survived another encounter, but she knew the storm within her, and the storm brewing between her and Hollister was far from over. She felt a sense of foreboding, a sense that the coming days would bring even greater challenges, even greater dangers. But she was ready. She was prepared to fight. She was her grandmother's granddaughter, and she would not be defeated. The brewing storm was a reflection of her inner state, a prelude to the battles yet to come. Chapter 9. The Price of Freedom. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and shimmering under a pale, watery sun. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, a refreshing contrast to the oppressive humidity of the previous day. June emerged from the cabin, her body stiff and aching, her mind weary but resolute. She checked on Belle, who had weathered the storm safely in the crumbling corral. She gave the mare some water and a handful of the remaining hay, grateful for her loyal companionship. She returned to the cabin and brewed a pot of coffee, the strong, bitter aroma filling the small space, a small comfort in a world of uncertainty. She sat by the window, sipping the coffee, watching the steam rise and dissipate in the cool morning air. She knew she couldn't stay at the homestead forever. It was too isolated, too vulnerable. Hollister would find her eventually, and she needed to be prepared. She needed a plan. She needed allies. She needed help. But where could she turn? She had no family left, except for Thomas, and she didn't even know where he was. She had no friends, no close confidants. She was alone, facing a powerful and ruthless enemy. She thought of Dry Creek, of the small, dusty town where she had lived her entire life. She had acquaintances there, people she had known for years, but she couldn't trust any of them. Hollister had too much influence, too much power. He could buy their loyalty, or threaten them into submission. There was one person, however, who might be willing to help her. A man named Silas, an old friend of Caleb's, a man who lived on the outskirts of town, a man who had a reputation for being independent, and for having a strong dislike of Hollister. Silas was a blacksmith, a skilled craftsman, a man of few words and strong principles. He had always been kind to June, and she had always respected him. He was her only hope. She finished her coffee and packed a small bag with supplies. She saddled Belle and rode away from the homestead, heading towards Dry Creek, towards Silas, towards an uncertain future. The journey was long and arduous, the terrain rough and unforgiving. June rode cautiously, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads, fearing Hollister's men might be searching for her. As she rode, she thought about the price of freedom, about the sacrifices she was willing to make to protect her land, her heritage, her independence. She was prepared to fight, to risk everything, to preserve what was rightfully hers. She reached Dry Creek as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty streets. The town was quiet, almost deserted, the usual hustle and bustle subdued by the lingering effects of the storm. She rode to the edge of town, to Silas's blacksmith shop, a small, sturdy building made of stone and wood. Smoke billowed from the chimney, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel echoed through the quiet evening air. She dismounted and tied Belle to a nearby post. She approached the shop cautiously, her hand resting on the butt of Caleb's rifle, which she had slung over her shoulder. She peered through the open doorway, her eyes adjusting to the dimly lit interior. Silas was working at the forge, his back to her, his muscular arms hammering a piece of red-hot metal, sparks flying in all directions. "Silas?" June called out, her voice tentative. He stopped hammering and turned around, his face grimy and sweat-streaked, his eyes squinting in the dim light. He recognized her instantly, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered face. "June?" he said, his voice gruff but kind. "What are you doing here?" I heard about Hollister." June stepped inside the shop, the heat from the forge washing over her, the scent of burning coal and hot metal filling her senses. "I need your help, Silas," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Hollister, he's trying to take my ranch. He's trying to take everything." Silas listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. She told him the whole story, from Thomas's gambling debts to Hollister's proposition, to her escape and her discovery of her grandmother's letters. When she finished, Silas remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the forge. "He's a bad one, that Hollister," he said finally, his voice low and grim. "Just like his father." "I know," June said. "But I won't let him win. I won't let him take what's mine." Silas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "What do you need, June?" he asked. "I need a place to stay," she said. "A place where Hollister won't find me. And I need allies. People who are willing to stand up to him." Silas thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I can offer you shelter," he said. "My place is small, but it's safe. And I know a few folks who aren't afraid of Hollister. Folks who have their own reasons for wanting to see him brought down." A glimmer of hope sparked within June. She wasn't alone after all. There were others who shared her defiance, who were willing to fight for what was right. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." He smiled, a rare and genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Don't thank me yet, June," he said. "The fight's just beginning. And the price of freedom, it's always high." The clang of the hammer resumed, but now, it sounded different to June. It was no longer just the sound of a blacksmith at work, but a call to arms. The fight had truly started. Chapter 10. Beneath a Starlit Veil. Silas's home was a small, unassuming cabin tucked away behind his blacksmith shop, hidden from the main street by a cluster of trees and a tangled, overgrown garden. It was a simple dwelling, sparsely furnished but clean and comfortable, offering a sense of peace and security that June hadn't felt in days. He showed her to a small room at the back of the cabin, a room that had clearly been unused for some time. It contained a narrow cot, a rickety washstand, and a single window overlooking a small, enclosed courtyard. "It ain't much," Silas said, his voice apologetic, "but it's safe. Hollister won't find you here." "It's perfect, Silas," June said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." He nodded, his eyes kind and understanding. "Get some rest, June," he said. "You look tired. We'll talk more in the morning." He left her alone, and June closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had been running on adrenaline for days, fueled by fear and determination, but now, in the quiet sanctuary of Silas's cabin, she finally allowed herself to relax, to let her guard down. She washed her face and hands in the chipped basin on the washstand, the cool water refreshing and invigorating. She changed into a clean shirt that Silas had provided, one of his own, which was far too large for her but soft and comfortable. She lay down on the cot, the mattress thin and lumpy, but surprisingly comfortable. She closed her eyes, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the hooting of an owl, the distant murmur of voices from the town. She thought of Hollister, of his dark, intense eyes, of his relentless pursuit. She knew he wouldn't give up easily, that he would continue to search for her, to try to force her into submission. But she was no longer alone. She had Silas, and she had the promise of other allies, people who were willing to stand up to Hollister, to fight for what was right. She felt a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance, a renewed sense of determination. She would not be defeated. She would not surrender. She would fight for her freedom, for her land, for her future. She drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with images of Hollister, of Caleb, of her grandmother, of a vast, starlit sky stretching out above her, a symbol of the endless possibilities, of the hope that still remained. She woke before dawn, the room still dark, the air cool and crisp. She rose and dressed, her movements quick and efficient. She went to the main room of the cabin, where Silas was already up, brewing coffee and cooking breakfast. "Morning, June," he said, his voice gruff but welcoming. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in days," June replied, her voice sincere. They ate breakfast together, a simple meal of bacon, eggs, and biscuits, the food nourishing and comforting. They talked about Hollister, about the situation, about the people Silas had in mind to help them. "There's a few ranchers," Silas said, his voice low and thoughtful, "folks who've had their own run-ins with Hollister. He's been trying to expand his holdings, using intimidation and underhanded tactics to force them off their land. And there's a couple of shopkeepers in town," he continued, "folks who are tired of his high prices and his controlling ways. He's got a stranglehold on this town, and they're ready to break free." There was also a former lawman, a man named Jedediah, who'd been run out of town by Hollister's influence after trying to stand up to him. June listened intently, her hope growing with each name Silas mentioned. She wasn't alone. There was a resistance forming, a coalition of people who were willing to fight for their freedom, for their independence. After breakfast, Silas led June out to the courtyard, a small, enclosed space hidden from the prying eyes of the town. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene. The sky was a tapestry of stars, slowly fading as the day approached. "I've sent word to a few folks," Silas said, his voice low and confidential. "They'll be here soon. We'll talk, we'll plan, we'll figure out how to fight back." June nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation. The fight was about to begin. She was ready. She was no longer a lone woman, running from a powerful enemy. She was part of something bigger, something stronger, something that might actually have a chance of succeeding. The starlit veil of the night before had given way to the dawn of a new day, a day of planning, of alliance, of resistance. The quiet courtyard, bathed in the soft morning light, was a sanctuary, a place where hope was rekindled, where a plan for freedom was about to be forged. Chapter 11. The Dance of Deception. The first to arrive was Martha, a sturdy, middle-aged woman with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. She owned a small ranch to the north of Dry Creek, a ranch that Hollister had been trying to acquire for years. She had refused to sell, and she had suffered the consequences. Her cattle had been rustled, her fences had been cut, her well had been poisoned. Next came Samuel, a quiet, unassuming man who ran the general store in town. He had been forced to pay exorbitant prices for Hollister's goods, and he had been threatened with violence if he dared to complain. He was tired of living in fear, and he was ready to fight back. Finally, Jedediah, the former lawman, arrived. He was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and a steely gaze. He had been run out of town by Hollister's influence, but he had never given up his fight for justice. He had been living in the hills, biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. They gathered in Silas's courtyard, a small, unlikely group of rebels, united by their common enemy, their shared desire for freedom. June felt a surge of hope, a sense of belonging, a feeling that she was no longer alone in this fight. Silas introduced June to the group, explaining her situation, her connection to the Hollister family, her determination to resist. They listened intently, their eyes filled with sympathy and understanding. "We're with you, June," Martha said, her voice firm and resolute. "We'll stand by you, and we'll fight Hollister together." "He's been a thorn in our side for too long," Samuel added, his voice quiet but determined. "It's time to put an end to his reign of terror." "I've been waiting for this day," Jedediah said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've got a score to settle with Hollister, and I intend to collect. They spent the rest of the morning discussing their options, sharing their knowledge of Hollister's operations, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities. They realized that a direct confrontation would be foolish. Hollister had too many men, too much power. They needed a different strategy, a way to undermine him, to weaken him, to expose his corruption. Jedediah suggested a plan, a daring and dangerous plan that involved deception, subterfuge, and a carefully orchestrated series of events. "We need to hit him where it hurts," Jedediah said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of anger and determination. "We need to disrupt his business, to turn his allies against him, to make him lose face. And we need to find evidence," he continued, "evidence of his illegal activities, evidence that we can use to bring him down." The plan involved June playing a central role, a role that was both risky and intriguing. She would pretend to accept Hollister's proposition. She would agree to marry him, but it would be a sham, a dance of deception designed to gain his trust, to get close to him, to uncover his secrets. June hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of being near Hollister, of pretending to be his willing bride, sent a shiver of revulsion through her. But she also realized that it was the only way, the most effective way to fight him, to defeat him. "It's dangerous, June," Silas said, his voice filled with concern. "I won't ask you to do it if you're not comfortable." June looked at the faces of the others, at their determined expressions, their shared desire for justice. She thought of Caleb, of her grandmother, of all those who had suffered at the hands of the Hollisters. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I'll play his game, and I'll beat him at it." A murmur of approval went around the group. They knew the risks, they knew the dangers, but they also knew that it was their best chance, their only chance. They spent the rest of the day refining the plan, working out the details, anticipating Hollister's reactions, preparing for every contingency. It was a complex and intricate scheme, a delicate dance of deception that could easily go wrong. As evening approached, June felt a mixture of fear and excitement, of dread and anticipation. She was about to embark on a dangerous journey, a journey into the heart of the enemy's camp. She was about to become someone she wasn't, to play a role that was both repulsive and exhilarating. She knew the risks, she knew the dangers, but she was ready. She was prepared to fight, to deceive, to do whatever it took to win. The dance of deception was about to begin, and June was ready to lead. The courtyard, once a sanctuary, was now a staging ground for a rebellion, a place where a daring plan was hatched, a plan that hinged on June's courage and her willingness to enter the lion's den. Chapter 12. Scars of the Past. June, dressed in the finest dress, she owned a simple, yet elegant, gown of deep blue silk that had belonged to her mother, stood on the porch of her ranch house, awaiting Hollister's arrival. The dress felt foreign on her, a reminder of a life she had left behind, a life of gentility and ease that seemed a distant memory now. She had brushed her hair until it shone, and she had applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks, trying to create an illusion of composure, of willingness, of surrender. She had sent a message to Hollister, a carefully worded note delivered by a young boy from town, stating that she had reconsidered his proposition, that she was ready to discuss the terms of their agreement. She had specified that he come alone, that she wanted to speak with him in private. She had spent the days since leaving Silas's cabin preparing for this moment, rehearsing her lines, practicing her expressions, trying to transform herself into the woman Hollister wanted her to be, compliant, submissive, agreeable. It was a role that disgusted her, a role that went against everything she believed in, everything she stood for. But it was a role she was willing to play, a sacrifice she was willing to make, to achieve her ultimate goal, to bring Hollister down, to avenge the wrongs he had committed, to protect her land and her freedom. She saw him approaching in the distance, riding his magnificent black stallion, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands clenched into fists. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, to steel herself for the performance. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked towards her, his eyes scanning her face, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in a dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie, an attire that was both elegant and intimidating. "June," he said, his voice low and even. "You look beautiful." It was a compliment, but it felt like an insult, a reminder of the power he held over her, of the objectification she was enduring. "Thank you, Beau," she said, forcing herself to use his first name, forcing herself to smile, to meet his gaze. "I'm glad you came." He stepped closer, his presence dominating the space around her. The scent of leather and cologne, a more refined fragrance than she remembered, filled her senses. "I was surprised to receive your message," he said, his eyes searching her face, trying to gauge her sincerity. "You seemed so resistant before." "I've had time to think," June said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "I've realized that you were right. I have no choice." He smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm glad you've come to your senses, June," he said. "You won't regret this." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. The contact sent a shiver of revulsion through her, but she forced herself not to flinch, to maintain the illusion of compliance. "Come inside," she said, turning and leading him into the house. The interior was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, creating an atmosphere of intimacy, of secrecy. June had prepared a simple meal, a roast chicken, some potatoes, and some vegetables, the aroma filling the room, a subtle attempt to create a sense of normalcy, of domesticity. They sat at the table, facing each other, the silence between them thick and tense. Hollister ate with relish, complimenting her on the food, his eyes never leaving her face. June picked at her food, her appetite gone, her mind racing, trying to anticipate his next move, trying to find an opening, a way to gain his trust, to uncover his secrets. "So," Hollister said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "you're ready to become my wife?" "Yes," June said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction.
"Good," he said.
"Very good. We'll be married next week, here at the ranch. I'll make all the arrangements." June nodded, her heart sinking. Next week. It was happening so fast. She had so little time to prepare, to gather the evidence she needed. "There's one condition," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze firm. Hollister raised an eyebrow, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "And what is that?"
"Thomas," she said.
"I want to know where he is. I want to make sure he's safe." Hollister hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your brother is away," he said. "He's taking care of some business for me." It was a lie, June knew. But she couldn't challenge him, not yet. "I want to see him," she said. "Before the wedding." Hollister considered her request, his expression unreadable. "I'll see what I can do," he said finally. "But I make no promises." The conversation continued, a carefully choreographed dance of deception, of feigned affection, of hidden agendas. June played her role flawlessly, pretending to be a submissive, compliant bride to be, while secretly observing Hollister, analyzing his words, his expressions, his body language, searching for any clue, any weakness, any vulnerability. As the evening wore on, Hollister began to relax, to let his guard down. He started talking about his past, about his childhood, about his father, a man he clearly admired and feared. He spoke of the hardships he had endured, the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made to build his empire. He revealed scars, both physical and emotional, scars that hinted at a deeper, more complex man beneath the ruthless exterior. June listened intently, her initial revulsion slowly giving way to a grudging respect, even pity. He was a product of his past, a victim of his own upbringing, a man trapped in a cycle of violence and ambition. But she couldn't forget who he was, what he had done, what he was still doing. She couldn't allow herself to feel sympathy for him, to be swayed by his stories. She had a mission to accomplish, a promise to keep, and she would not fail. The scars of the past, both his and hers, fueled the present conflict, a reminder of the stakes involved, of the price of freedom, of the enduring power of family legacies. Chapter 13. The Reckoning Wind. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of preparations orchestrated by Hollister with a meticulousness that both impressed and unnerved June. He spared no expense, transforming the simple ranch house into a lavish, albeit temporary, setting for the ceremony. He brought in caterers, decorators, musicians, even a preacher from a neighboring town, all to create an illusion of grandeur, of legitimacy, of love. June played her part, pretending to be a happy, excited bride-to-be, while secretly working with Silas, Martha, Samuel, and Jedediah to gather evidence of Hollister's illegal activities. It was a dangerous game, a delicate balancing act, requiring constant vigilance, constant deception. She had managed to see Thomas, briefly, under Hollister's watchful eye. He looked pale and drawn, his eyes filled with shame and regret. He had tried to apologize, to explain, but June had silenced him, warning him to be careful, to play along, to wait for her signal. She had also discovered a hidden room in the ranch house, a small, locked room that Hollister had forbidden her to enter. With Silas's help, she had managed to pick the lock, revealing a treasure trove of incriminating documents, ledgers, contracts, letters, all detailing Hollister's illegal land grabs, his intimidation tactics, his bribery of local officials. She had carefully photographed the documents, using a small camera that Silas had provided, and she had hidden the copies in a safe place, ready to be used as evidence when the time was right. The wedding day arrived, a bright, sunny day with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of music. The ranch was teeming with guests, mostly Hollister's men and associates, a few curious townsfolk, and a handful of reluctant witnesses, including Silas, Martha, Samuel, and Jedediah, who were there to provide support and to observe. June stood before a mirror, dressed in a white lace gown that Hollister had chosen for her, a gown that was both beautiful and suffocating. She looked at her reflection, at the woman staring back at her, a woman she barely recognized. She was a stranger in her own life, playing a role that was both foreign and familiar. She thought of her grandmother, of her own wedding day, of the promises that had been broken, of the dreams that had been shattered. She felt a surge of anger, of determination, of resolve. She would not let history repeat itself. She would not let Hollister win. She heard a knock on the door, and Hollister entered the room, his eyes sweeping over her, his expression a mixture of pride and possession. "You look exquisite, June," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Ready to become my wife?" "Yes, Beau," she said, forcing herself to smile, to meet his gaze. "I am." He took her arm, and they walked together towards the makeshift altar that had been erected in the yard, beneath a canopy of flowers and ribbons. The guests turned to watch them, their faces a mixture of curiosity, envy, and disapproval. The preacher began the ceremony, his voice droning on about love, commitment, and obedience. June listened to the words, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She felt a sense of unreality, of detachment, as if she were watching a play, a drama in which she was both an actor and a spectator. She repeated the vows, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze firm. She promised to love, honor, and obey Hollister, knowing that her words were lies, that her intentions were anything but. Hollister slipped a ring on her finger, a large, ornate diamond that felt heavy and constricting. He kissed her, his lips firm and demanding, a kiss that was meant to be a symbol of love, but that felt like a brand, a mark of ownership. The guests applauded, their cheers echoing through the yard, but June barely heard them. She was focused on Hollister, on his reaction, on his satisfaction. He had won. He had gotten what he wanted. Or so he thought. As the reception began, June circulated among the guests, playing the role of the gracious hostess, while secretly observing, listening, gathering information. She noticed that several of Hollister's men were drunk, their tongues loosened by alcohol, their guards down. She overheard snippets of conversations, whispers of illegal deals, of threats, of violence. She saw Hollister talking to a group of men, his expression serious, his voice low and confidential. She knew that he was planning something, that he was up to no good. She saw Thomas standing alone, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with fear. She knew that he was in danger, that Hollister was using him, manipulating him. She felt a surge of anger, of protectiveness. She had to act, and she had to act soon. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, June knew that the time had come. The reckoning wind was blowing, carrying with it the promise of justice, of retribution, of freedom. She signaled to Silas, Martha, Samuel, and Jedediah, and they began to put their plan into action. The carefully orchestrated charade was about to reach its climax. Chapter 14. Trails of Trust. The plan was intricate, relying on precise timing and the element of surprise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery glow across the landscape, Jedediah, disguised as one of Hollister's men, approached the group Hollister was conversing with, a group that included the corrupt sheriff and a few of Hollister's most trusted lieutenants. Jedediah, feigning drunkenness, accidentally bumped into the sheriff, spilling a drink on his shirt. The sheriff, already agitated and fueled by alcohol, exploded in anger, shoving Jedediah roughly. Jedediah, playing his part, retaliated, throwing a punch that connected with the sheriff's jaw. A brawl erupted, a carefully orchestrated chaos designed to distract Hollister and his men. Meanwhile, Martha and Samuel, posing as concerned guests, slipped away from the crowd and headed towards the ranch house. Their task was to retrieve the photographic evidence that June had hidden, the proof of Hollister's illegal activities. Silas, remaining near June, kept a watchful eye on Hollister, ready to intervene if necessary. June, maintaining the facade of the concerned bride, approached Hollister, her voice trembling with feigned anxiety. "Beau, what's happening?" she asked, clutching his arm.
"I'm scared."
Hollister, distracted by the fight and visibly annoyed by the disruption, tried to reassure her. "It's nothing, June," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "Just a few drunkards. I'll take care of it." He pushed her gently aside and strode towards the melee, shouting orders, trying to restore order. This was the moment June had been waiting for. She slipped away unnoticed, her heart pounding in her chest. She headed towards the barn, where she had arranged to meet Thomas. She had given him specific instructions, a risky plan that could either save him or condemn him. She found him waiting for her, his face pale and strained, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "June," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" "It's time, Thomas," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "Time to make things right." She handed him a small, leather-bound pouch. "Inside," she said, "is money. Enough for you to start a new life, somewhere far away from Dry Creek, far away from Hollister." Thomas stared at her, his mouth agape. "But how?" "Don't ask questions," June said. "Just go.
Now.
Before it's too late." She had also given him a letter addressed to the governor of the territory, a letter detailing Hollister's crimes, a letter that Thomas was to deliver personally. Thomas hesitated, his eyes filled with doubt. I don't know if I can do this, June," he said.
"I'm scared."
"You can do it, Thomas," June said, her voice filled with conviction. "You have to. For yourself, for me, for Caleb." She placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch firm and reassuring. "Be brave, Thomas," she said. "Be the man I know you can be." He nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers, a flicker of determination replacing the fear. He took the pouch and the letter, clutching them tightly in his hands. "I won't let you down, June," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I swear I won't." He turned and disappeared into the darkness, heading towards the open road, towards a new life, a chance for redemption. June watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had done all she could for him. Now it was up to him. She returned to the main house, just as Martha and Samuel were emerging, their faces flushed with excitement. They had retrieved the evidence, without being detected. The brawl had subsided, the sheriff and his deputies having restored order, albeit with a few bruised faces and broken bones. Hollister was furious, his face red with anger, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for the culprits. June approached him, pretending to be distraught. "Beau, this is terrible," she exclaimed. "Our wedding day ruined." Hollister, still seething with anger, tried to calm her down. "Don't worry, June," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I'll find out who's responsible for this, and they'll pay." That's when Jedediah stepped forward, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes gleaming with triumph. "I know who's responsible, Hollister," he said, his voice loud and clear. "You are." Hollister stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and rage. "What are you talking about, Jedediah?" He snarled. "You're drunk." "I'm not drunk, Hollister," Jedediah retorted. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge that had been stripped from him years ago, a badge that symbolized his authority, his integrity. "I'm reinstating myself as lawman of this town," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "And I'm placing you under arrest." The trails of trust, carefully laid and meticulously followed, had led to this moment. A confrontation, a reckoning, a turning of the tide. The seemingly chaotic events were, in fact, a carefully orchestrated plan, a testament to the courage and resilience of a small group of people fighting for justice. Chapter 15. A bargain struck. Hollister stared at Jedediah, his face contorted in disbelief and fury. "You're insane, old man," he sneered. "You have no authority here." "I have the authority of the law," Jedediah retorted, his voice unwavering. "And I have evidence of your crimes." He gestured towards Martha and Samuel, who stepped forward, holding the photographic copies of the incriminating documents. "These," Jedediah said, his voice ringing with triumph, "prove your illegal land grabs, your intimidation tactics, your bribery of public officials. You're finished, Hollister." Hollister's eyes darted around the room, assessing the situation, realizing that he was trapped. His men, outnumbered and disarmed by the sheriff's deputies, who had switched their allegiance to Jedediah, were unable to intervene. He turned to June, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "You," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You set me up." June met his gaze, her chin lifting in defiance. "Yes, Beau," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I did." "You played me," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You pretended to love me." "I never loved you, Hollister," June said, her voice cold and hard. "I used you, just as you used me, just as you used everyone else." Hollister's face twisted in rage. He lunged at June, his hands reaching for her throat. But Silas, who had been standing silently by her side, intervened, grabbing Hollister's arm and twisting it behind his back. "Don't touch her," Silas said, his voice low and threatening. "Or you'll answer to me." Hollister struggled against Silas's grip, but the blacksmith was too strong. He held him firmly, his eyes blazing with anger. Jedediah stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Take him away," he ordered the deputies. "And lock him up." The deputies, relieved to be on the right side of the law again, obeyed without hesitation. They dragged Hollister away, his curses and threats echoing through the yard. The guests, who had witnessed the entire scene, stood in stunned silence. They had come expecting a wedding, a celebration of Hollister's power and wealth. Instead, they had witnessed his downfall, his humiliation, his arrest. June looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had helped her, at the people who had risked their lives to fight for justice. She felt a surge of gratitude, of pride, of relief. It was over. Hollister was defeated. She had won. But the victory felt bittersweet. She had lost her innocence, her trust, her illusions. She had been forced to become someone she wasn't, to play a role that had disgusted her. She had been forced to confront the darkness within herself, the capacity for deception, for manipulation, for revenge. She had also lost Thomas, perhaps forever. She had sent him away, to protect him, to give him a chance at a new life. But she didn't know if she would ever see him again. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to see Silas standing beside her, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right, June?" he asked, his voice gentle. I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I feel empty." He put his arm around her, offering her comfort, support. "You did what you had to do, June," he said. "You were brave. You were strong. You saved your ranch, and you saved this town." "But at what cost, Silas?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "At what cost?" He didn't answer. He knew that the price of freedom was always high, that the scars of battle often ran deep. The following days were a blur of activity. Hollister was formally charged with numerous crimes, and his empire began to crumble. His assets were seized, his properties were confiscated, his henchmen were arrested. The town of Dry Creek celebrated its liberation, its newfound freedom. The people hailed June as a heroine, a savior, a woman who had dared to stand up to a tyrant. But June felt no joy, no satisfaction. She felt only a profound sense of weariness, of emptiness, of loss. She returned to her ranch house, to the familiar surroundings that had once been a source of comfort, but that now felt tainted, haunted by the memories of Hollister, of the deception, of the betrayal. She received a letter from Thomas, a short, hastily written note from a town far away. He was safe, he was working, he was trying to build a new life. He thanked her for everything she had done, and he promised to make amends, someday. June read the letter, her eyes filling with tears. She was glad that he was safe, that he had escaped Hollister's grasp. But she also knew that their relationship would never be the same, that the scars of the past would always be between them. She was alone again, but she was no longer the same woman she had been before. She had been tested, she had been challenged, she had been transformed. She had learned the true meaning of courage, of resilience, of sacrifice. She would rebuild. She knew a bargain had been struck, not just with Hollister, but with herself. She had traded a part of her innocence for freedom, a piece of her heart for justice. And she would live with the consequences forever. Chapter 16. The Heart's Frontier. The weeks following Hollister's arrest were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of slowly piecing together the shattered fragments of June's life. The ranch, once a symbol of her vulnerability and potential loss, gradually became a sanctuary again, a place where she could reconnect with the land, with her past, with herself. The physical work was demanding, but it was also therapeutic. She mended fences, repaired buildings, tended to her horses, all the while feeling a sense of purpose, of renewal, of reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The scars of Hollister's presence, the lavish decorations, the lingering atmosphere of deceit, slowly faded, replaced by the familiar comfort of her simple, rustic life. The community of Dry Creek also began to heal. With Hollister gone, the town breathed a collective sigh of relief. Businesses flourished, freed from his stranglehold. People felt safer, more empowered, more connected to each other. June was often hailed as a heroine, a savior, but she shied away from the praise, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. She had simply done what she had to do, what anyone in her position would have done, she believed. She maintained a close relationship with Silas, Martha, Samuel, and Jedediah, the small group of rebels who had become her unlikely allies, her trusted friends. They shared a bond forged in adversity, a connection that transcended the boundaries of age, gender, and social standing. Jedediah, reinstated as lawman, worked tirelessly to restore order and justice to the town. He was a fair and honest man, a stark contrast to the corrupt sheriff who had preceded him. He often sought June's advice, valuing her wisdom, her resilience, her innate sense of right and wrong. Martha's ranch, once threatened by Hollister, thrived under her capable management. She became a mentor to June, sharing her knowledge of ranching, her experience of surviving in this harsh and unforgiving land. Samuel's general store became a hub of community activity, a place where people gathered to share news, to exchange gossip, to offer support and encouragement. He always had a kind word and a warm smile for June, grateful for her bravery, her unwavering determination. Silas remained her closest confidant, her steadfast friend, her rock. He was always there for her, offering a listening ear, a helping hand, a shoulder to cry on. He understood her pain, her struggles, her triumphs, better than anyone else. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape, June and Silas sat on the porch of her ranch house, sharing a quiet moment of reflection. "You know, June," Silas said, his voice low and thoughtful, "you've changed." June looked at him, her eyes questioning. "How so?" "You're stronger," he said. "More confident. More at peace." June smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes.
"I think I am," she said.
"I've been through a lot, but I've also learned a lot. About myself, about life, about love." Silas raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his gaze. "Love?" June blushed, a rare occurrence for her. "Not romantic love, Silas," she said. "Not yet anyway. But a different kind of love. The love of friendship, the love of community, the love of the land." Silas nodded, his eyes understanding. "That's a powerful kind of love, June," he said. "A kind of love that can heal, that can sustain, that can endure." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset, feeling the peace and tranquility of the evening. June felt a sense of gratitude, of contentment, of hope. She had been through a fire, a trial that had tested her to her limits. But she had emerged stronger, wiser, more resilient. She had discovered a new frontier, a frontier within herself, a frontier of the heart. She realized that she was no longer defined by her past, by her losses, by her scars. She was defined by her present, by her choices, by her actions. She was defined by her courage, her resilience, her unwavering commitment to justice, to freedom, to love. She knew that the future was uncertain, that there would be challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced her demons, she had conquered her fears, she had found her strength. She was ready to embrace whatever life had in store for her, to live each day to the fullest, to cherish the simple joys, to appreciate the beauty that surrounded her. She had found her peace, her purpose, her home. Not just in the physical sense of the ranch, but in the deeper sense of belonging, of connection, of love. The heart's frontier was vast and unexplored, but June was ready to embark on that journey, to discover the hidden landscapes within herself, to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 17. Hollister's Secret. Several months had passed since Hollister's arrest and imprisonment. Life in Dry Creek had returned to a semblance of normalcy, a normalcy built on a foundation of newfound freedom and justice. June had settled back into the rhythm of ranch life, her days filled with the familiar tasks of caring for her animals, maintaining her property, and connecting with her community. However, a lingering unease persisted beneath the surface of her newfound peace. Hollister's trial was approaching, and despite the overwhelming evidence against him, June couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that a piece of the puzzle was still missing. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jedediah paid June a visit, his weathered face etched with concern. "June," he said, his voice grave, "we have a problem." June's heart sank. "What is it, Jedediah?" "Hollister's lawyer," he said, "he's a slick one from back east. He's filed a motion to dismiss the charges, claiming lack of jurisdiction and insufficient evidence." June frowned. "But we have the photographs, the documents, everything." "I know," Jedediah said, "but his lawyer is arguing that the evidence was obtained illegally, that it's inadmissible in court." June felt a surge of anger and frustration. "He can't get away with this, Jedediah," she said.
"He's guilty as sin."
"I know, June," Jedediah said, "but we need something more, something concrete, something that can't be disputed." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "There's something else," he said. "Hollister, he's been asking to see you." June's heart skipped a beat.
"Me? Why?"
"He says he has something to tell you," Jedediah said, "something that could change everything." June hesitated. She had no desire to see Hollister, to face the man who had caused her so much pain and suffering. But she also knew that she couldn't ignore his request, that she had to hear what he had to say. "All right, Jedediah," she said, her voice resigned. "I'll see him." The following day, June, accompanied by Jedediah, visited Hollister in the small, dimly lit jail in Dry Creek. He was sitting on a cot, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation. He had lost weight, and his once impeccable attire was now rumpled and stained. "June," he said, his voice hoarse. "I knew you'd come." June remained silent, her gaze fixed on him, her expression unreadable. "I have a secret, June," he said, "a secret that I've kept for years, a secret that could change your life." June raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "What kind of secret?" Hollister hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It's about your father," he said, his voice low and confidential. "Caleb, he wasn't who—" June's heart pounded in her chest.
What are you talking about?
"Caleb," Hollister said, "he had a past, a dark past. He was involved in things that you don't know about." June felt a surge of anger, of disbelief. "You're lying," she said, her voice trembling. "Caleb was a good man." "He was," Hollister said, "but he also had secrets. Secrets that he kept from you, secrets that could have gotten him killed." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "I know the truth, June," he said, "and I'm the only one who does." June felt a growing unease, a sense that Hollister might be telling the truth, or at least a part of the truth. She remembered the letter from Caleb, the letter she had found in his box, the letter that had warned her about Hollister's father, the letter that had hinted at a past debt, a past connection. "What is it, Hollister?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you hiding?" Hollister leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Caleb," he said, "he wasn't just a rancher.
He was also an outlaw."
He rode with a gang that robbed trains, banks people." June stared at him, speechless. The revelation was shocking, unbelievable, yet somehow it resonated with a hidden truth, a truth that she had always sensed, but had never been able to articulate. "And," Hollister continued, "he stole something valuable, something that belonged to my father." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "I know where it is, June," he said, "and I'm willing to tell you for a price." The secret was out, a secret that shattered June's image of her beloved Caleb, a secret that linked him to Hollister in a way she had never imagined. It was a bargain, a dangerous bargain, but one that June felt compelled to consider. Hollister's secret was the key, not only to his downfall, but also to uncovering a hidden truth about her own past. Chapter 18. Unspoken Truths. The price, Hollister explained, was his freedom. He wanted June to testify on his behalf, to claim that she had coerced him into marriage, that she had manipulated him, that she had stolen the evidence from his private room. He wanted her to lie, to perjure herself, to betray everything she believed in. It was an outrageous request, a desperate gamble, but June couldn't dismiss it out of hand. Hollister's revelation about Caleb, however shocking, had struck a chord, resonating with a long-held unease, a sense that there were gaps in her understanding of her husband's past. She looked at Hollister, his face pale and haggard, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and cunning. He was a liar, a manipulator, a man who had caused her immense pain. But he was also the keeper of a secret that could potentially rewrite her history, redefine her understanding of her own identity. "Why should I believe you, Hollister?" she asked, her voice cold and skeptical. "You've lied to me before." "I know," he said, his voice earnest, almost pleading. "But this is different, June. This is the truth. I swear it." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father, he hid the stolen goods on your ranch. He hid them somewhere only he knew. After he reformed, after he married your mother, he couldn't bring himself to return them, fearing it would expose his past and endanger you." "Where?" June asked, her voice barely audible. "Where did he hide them?" "I'll tell you," Hollister said, "but only if you agree to help me. Only if you testify on my behalf." June felt torn. She despised Hollister. She loathed his manipulative tactics, but she also yearned to know the truth about Caleb, to understand the hidden complexities of his life. She needed to know if the man she had loved, the man she had idealized, was truly the person she believed him to be. She looked at Jedediah, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knew the stakes, he understood the dilemma, but he offered no guidance, no judgment. "I need time to think," June said, her voice trembling. Hollister nodded, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "I understand," he said. "But don't take too long, June. The trial is fast approaching." June and Jedediah left the jail, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths, with unresolved questions, with the weight of a decision that could change everything. As they walked back to June's ranch, Jedediah finally spoke. "What are you going to do, June?" he asked, his voice gentle, concerned. "I don't know, Jedediah," she said, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I just don't know." She thought of Caleb, of his kindness, his strength, his unwavering love for her. Could he really have been an outlaw, a thief, a man who had lived a life of violence and deception? She thought of her mother, a quiet, gentle woman who had died young, leaving June with a legacy of love and mystery. Had she known about Caleb's past? Had she accepted him, forgiven him, loved him despite his flaws? She thought of Hollister, a man driven by greed, by revenge, by a desire to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Could she trust him? Could she believe anything he said? She reached the ranch house, the familiar surroundings offering a small measure of comfort, a sense of grounding in a world that had been turned upside down. She went inside, to Caleb's study, a room she hadn't entered in months, a room that held the echoes of his presence, the remnants of his life. She looked around the room, at the bookshelves filled with his favorite books, at the desk where he had spent countless hours working, at the photographs on the wall, images of a life that now seemed incomplete. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of grief, confusion, and determination. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. She began to search the room, systematically, meticulously, looking for any clue, any hint, any sign of Caleb's hidden past. She searched through drawers, through boxes, through books, through every nook and cranny, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She found nothing. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room. June was exhausted, discouraged, ready to give up. Then she noticed something she had overlooked before. A small, almost imperceptible crack in one of the wooden panels on the wall, a crack that seemed out of place, unnatural. She pressed on the panel, her heart racing. It moved, slightly, revealing a hidden compartment, a small, secret space behind the wall. Inside, she found a small, wooden box, a box similar to the one that had contained Caleb's letter, the box that had revealed Hollister's connection to her grandmother. She opened the box, her hands shaking. Inside, she found the truth. The unspoken truths, hidden for years, were finally revealed, not in words, but in objects, in relics of a past that had shaped the present, a past that June was finally ready to confront. Chapter 19. Redemption's Road. Inside the box, June found a collection of items that painted a vivid, albeit complex, picture of Caleb's past. There was a worn leather-bound journal, filled with entries in Caleb's familiar handwriting, detailing his life as an outlaw, his regrets, his yearning for redemption. There was a faded photograph of a group of men, young, rugged, and defiant, Caleb among them, their faces a mixture of bravado and vulnerability. There was a small, silver locket containing a miniature portrait of June's mother, a testament to Caleb's love for her, a love that had ultimately led him to abandon his outlaw life. And there was a bag, a heavy canvas bag filled with gold coins, the stolen loot from a long-ago train robbery, the treasure that Hollister had claimed as his inheritance. June sat on the floor, surrounded by the artifacts of Caleb's past, her mind reeling, her heart aching. The truth was both shocking and relieving. Caleb had been an outlaw, a thief, a man who had lived a life of violence and deception. But he had also been a man who had sought redemption, a man who had found love, a man who had tried to make amends for his past. The journal entries were particularly revealing. Caleb wrote of his guilt, his shame, his remorse for the pain he had caused. He wrote of his love for June's mother, a love that had transformed him, that had given him the strength to break free from his former life. He wrote of his fear of exposure, his fear of losing the woman he loved, his fear of endangering his daughter. He had planned to return the stolen money, but he had never found the right opportunity, the right way to do it without revealing his past, without risking his family's safety. He had hidden the money, hoping that someday, somehow, it could be used for good, for a purpose that would redeem his past sins. June closed the journal, her eyes filled with tears. She understood now. She forgave him. She loved him, not for the man he had been, but for the man he had become. She knew what she had to do. She would not testify for Hollister. She would not lie. She would not betray her principles. She would not compromise her integrity. But she would also not keep the stolen money. She would return it, not to Hollister, but to the rightful owners, to the people who had been robbed, to the community that had suffered. She would use the money to build a school, a hospital, a library, something that would benefit the town of Dry Creek, something that would honor Caleb's memory, something that would redeem his past. She packed the box, carefully placing the items back inside, preserving the evidence of Caleb's journey, of his transformation, of his redemption. The next morning, June, accompanied by Jedediah, returned to the jail to confront Hollister. "I know the truth, Hollister," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I know about Caleb's past. And I know about the stolen money." Hollister's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. "So, you'll testify for me?" he asked, a glimmer of hope in his voice. "No," June said, her voice cold and hard. "I won't lie for you, Hollister. But I will return the money. To the people it belongs to." Hollister's face twisted in rage. "You fool," he shouted. "You could have had everything. You could have been my wife. You could have been rich." "I don't want your riches, Hollister," June said, her voice calm and unwavering. "And I would never be your wife. I'd rather be a poor woman with a clear conscience than a rich woman living a lie." Jedediah stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "It's over, Hollister," he said. "You're going to trial, and you're going to pay for your crimes." Hollister glared at them, his eyes filled with hatred, with defeat. He knew he had lost. He had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, by a woman he had underestimated, a woman he had tried to control, a woman he had failed to break. The trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against Hollister was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to a long prison term, his empire crumbling around him, his dreams of power and wealth reduced to ashes. June, with the help of Silas, Martha, Samuel, and Jedediah, used the recovered money to establish a foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to improving the lives of the people of Dry Creek. They built a school, a hospital, and a library, providing education, healthcare, and knowledge to a community that had long been deprived of such resources. June had found her redemption, not in escaping her past, but in confronting it, in embracing it, in transforming it into something positive, something meaningful, something that would benefit future generations. She had honored Caleb's memory, not by concealing his sins, but by acknowledging them, by atoning for them, by building a better future on the foundations of his past. The road to redemption was long and arduous, but June had walked it with courage, with grace, with an unwavering commitment to justice and to love. Chapter 20. The Final Sunset. Years passed, and the wounds of the past gradually healed, leaving behind scars that served as reminders of the battles fought, the lessons learned, the resilience gained. June remained on her ranch, her life intertwined with the land, with the community, with the legacy she had inherited and transformed. The foundation she had established flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and progress for Dry Creek and the surrounding area. The school, the hospital, and the library thrived, providing essential services and enriching the lives of countless individuals. June took an active role in the Foundation's work, her wisdom, her compassion, and her unwavering determination guiding its mission. She never remarried, her heart still holding a space for Caleb, a space filled with a complex mixture of love, forgiveness, and understanding. But she was not alone. She had Silas, her steadfast friend, her loyal companion, her constant source of support and encouragement. They shared a deep bond, a connection forged in adversity, a friendship that had blossomed into something more. It was a quiet, unspoken love, a love built on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep appreciation for each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. They never spoke of marriage, never felt the need to formalize their relationship. They were content with their companionship, with their shared life, with the quiet understanding that passed between them. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a breathtaking panorama of colors across the vast, open sky, June and Silas sat on the porch of her ranch house, watching the spectacle unfold. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of sage and pine, the familiar fragrance of the land they both loved. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" June said, her voice soft, filled with awe. "It is," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Just like you." June smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, their touch warm and comforting. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the colors fade, the stars begin to emerge, the moon rising slowly in the east. They felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of completion. They had both lived through storms, through hardships, through losses. They had both faced their demons, they had conquered their fears, they had found their strength. They had both found love, not the fiery, passionate love of youth, but a deeper, more enduring love, a love born of shared experience, of mutual respect, of unwavering loyalty. June looked at Silas, his weathered face illuminated by the soft moonlight, his eyes filled with kindness, with understanding, with love. She knew that she was blessed, that she had found a true partner, a soulmate, a companion for the journey. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling his warmth, his strength, his presence. She felt a sense of gratitude, of peace, of home. The final sunset of their shared journey was not an ending, but a beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with quiet joys, with shared moments, with a love that would endure, a love that would transcend the boundaries of time, of space, of life. They had found their peace, their purpose, their love. They had found their home, not just in the physical sense of the ranch, but in the deeper sense of belonging, of connection of each other. The vast, starlit sky above them was a testament to the endless possibilities, to the enduring power of love, to the beauty of a life well lived, a life shared, a life complete. The final sunset was not a farewell, but a celebration of a journey completed, of a love found, of a life fulfilled. Epilogue. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a gentle sigh that carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant murmur of Dry Creek. June stood by Caleb's grave, the simple wooden cross weathered and worn, a silent testament to the passage of time. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with the map of her life, her eyes still holding the spark of resilience, of wisdom, of love. She was not alone. Beside her stood a young woman, her granddaughter, Sarah, the daughter of Thomas, who had returned to Dry Creek years ago, a changed man, a man who had finally found his footing, his purpose, his peace. Sarah had grown up on the ranch, listening to the stories of her grandmother's courage, her resilience, her unwavering commitment to justice. She had inherited June's spirit, her strength, her love for the land. "He would have been proud of you, Grandma," Sarah said, her voice soft, filled with respect. June smiled, a gentle, knowing smile.
"I think he would have," she said.
"And he would have been proud of you, too." They stood in silence for a moment, honoring the memory of Caleb, of the complex, flawed, but ultimately redeemed man he had been. June looked out at the vast, sprawling landscape, at the rolling hills, the distant mountains, the endless sky. It was a beautiful land, a harsh land, a land that had shaped her, molded her, made her who she was. She felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of completion. She had lived a full life, a life filled with challenges, with triumphs, with losses, with love. She had fought for her freedom, for her land, for her family. She had faced her demons, she had conquered her fears, she had found her strength. She had loved and been loved, she had learned and she had grown. She had made a difference in the world. She had left a legacy of courage, of resilience, of hope. She knew that her time was drawing near, that the final sunset of her own life was approaching. But she was not afraid. She was ready. She had lived a good life, a meaningful life, a life fulfilled. She looked at Sarah, her granddaughter, her heir, the future of her family, the future of the land. She saw in her the same spirit, the same strength, the same love that had sustained her through all the years. She knew that the legacy would continue, that the story would go on, that the land would endure. She smiled, a peaceful, serene smile. She had done her best. She had given her all. She had lived her life with purpose, with passion, with love. The wind whispered through the grass, a gentle lullaby, a song of peace, of contentment, of completion. June closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, the coolness of the breeze on her skin, the love of her family in her heart. She was ready. She was home. She was free. The final sunset was not an ending, but a transition, a passage to another realm, a realm where love endured, where peace reigned, where life continued. The epilogue was not a farewell, but a promise of continuity, of legacy, of love everlasting. The end.